So welcome everybody to the third seminar in the MarSocSci Oz seminar series. Just a couple of housekeeping notes before we get started. This seminar is being recorded, so please make sure to turn off your microphone when the speaker is giving the seminar. And if you have any questions, please either post them in the chat as we go along or save them until the end. So it's my real pleasure today to introduce Lyn Goldsworthy, who's going to talk to us about finding the conservation in CCAMLR. Is CCAMLR a conservation regime or just another fisheries body? Lyn has spent more than 35 years working in the non-government sector as a campaigner, educator, and in organisational development. This work has been primarily, but not exclusively, in the environment sector, focusing particularly on Antarctic conservation, high seas management and climate change. She's currently undertaking a PhD at the Institute for Marine and Antarctic Studies in the University of Tasmania, researching the effectiveness of the Convention on the Conservation of Antarctic Marine Living Resources, CCAMLR. She has attended many high seas meetings, regime CCAMLR and Antarctic Treaty meetings, representing environmental non-government organisations on the Australian delegation or as part of an observer team. Lyn was awarded the Order of Australia member for services to conservation and environment in 1991 and the New Zealand Antarctic Conservation Trophy in 1990. She has served and is serving on government advisory committees and several non-government sector boards. And with that, I will pass over to you, Lyn.
Thank you very much. So, can everyone see the screen? I'll assume yes, thank you very much. Okay, so I just realised I'm self-organised here. So I want to look at the Convention on the Conservation of Antarctic Marine Living Resources, otherwise known as CCAMLR. It's frequently cited as a world leader in the application of ecosystem-based and precautionary approaches to its fisheries management practices, but it's also described, including in its own public record, as a conservation regime with the attributes and responsibilities of fisheries management, but responsible for the conservation of all marine living biota in the convention area. Right, there we go. Many other organisations these days with responsibilities for fisheries management are now, at least in theory, embracing EBFM and precautionary approaches to their management, fisheries management. So the question really is, does CCAMLR still stand out? Does it do anything more than a straight fisheries management regime? And so that's what I want to explore a little bit today. Does it act as a conservation regime or a fisheries regime? And I'm going to draw from a bit of my research around the interpretation of the objective of CCAMLR, around what management measures or conservation measures have been adopted, how or what science it requests from the scientific committee and how it deals with that, and how it looks at the non-harvested species. Of course, there are many other ways that we could look at the difference. This is just as far as I've got thus far. So just some background, although I suspect all of you are very familiar with this, but just a little bit of background. CCAMLR is part of the Antarctic system of treaties, and it was negotiated by the members of the Antarctic Treaty in the late 70s and came into force in 82. It was negotiated in response to a growing interest in particularly krill harvesting, and krill is a keystone species in the food web in Southern Ocean, and there was a concern that if that developed, then it could cause considerable problems. There are currently 26 members, including the EU, and 10 acceding states. The objective is conservation, which includes conditional rational use, and I'll talk a bit about that in a minute, As I've said, it's precautionary and ecosystem based. It currently has 69 conservation measures or management measures in force and 21 hortatory resolutions. The current harvested species are toothfish, icefish and krill, and it's accepted 2 large-scale marine protected areas. It has 4 vulnerable marine ecosystem areas that are protected, and there are no protected species. It has some very specific elements that distinguish it from a standard regional fisheries regime. It has embedded treaty obligations. It's actually bound to acknowledge and support the principles of the Antarctic Treaty: peace, conservation, science and collaboration. It extends to all species. It's not responsible for the management of seals and whales, which are covered by other conventions, but it is responsible for the conservation of those species in the convention area. The rules for harvesting are actually embedded specifically and very articulately in the convention itself. It has explicit provisions to set aside areas for biodiversity and science. There is actually no automatic right to fish, and some members join with no intention to fish and have not fished. So how's CCAMLR viewed by its members? Well, this I drew from some 36 interviews that I did of past and present commissioners of the convention, and it was a really interesting range. Conservation regime, including or with the attributes of a fisheries management regime, regional fisheries management organisation plus, a fundamental element of the system of the Antarctic Treaty, bound by the principles of peace, science and conservation, something special, which is fascinating, and a regime with gold standard fisheries management regime, responsibilities and delivery. So I think that while there appears to be a range of iterations of how it's perceived by its members, I think it's clear that all members see it as having responsibilities that extend beyond what they perceive as being a standard regional fisheries management organisation. So let's start by looking at how the members interpret their objective and see if we can glean anything from that. So the CCAMLR objective, Article 2 of the Convention, is the conservation of Antarctic marine living resources, and Antarctic marine living resources are defined in Article 1, and they extend way beyond just harvested species. It clarifies that conservation in this context includes rational use, and then it says, but if you're going to harvest, if you're going to undertake harvesting which is seen as a rational use, then you must ensure the following 3 principles: that harvested populations are kept at stable recruitment levels, that the ecological relationships between the harvested and dependent and related populations are maintained, and that you prevent or minimise the risk of changes not being reversible, changes to the environment not being reversible within 2 to 3 decades. I think it's really important that you read the objective in the context of or in conjunction with the background to the negotiation of the convention and its links to the treaty and the conservation obligations that are embedded in the convention. So if we look at the negotiations for CCAMLR started off, sorry, I just need to move you guys a wee bit. Yeah, there you go, down there. Started off when, as I said, there was this concern about unregulated fishing and also an increasing interest in krill harvesting. And there was a article in the Antarctic Treaty that allowed the treaty nations to consider the negotiation of additional conventions. That's Article 9F. When they started the negotiations, it was very clear in the negotiations that when they referred to resources, marine living resources, they weren't limiting themselves to just commercially exploitable species. And they put into the convention that how harvesting could be permitted. It can only be permitted if conducted in accordance with the principles of conservation. So Robert Hoffman from the US was actually a member of the negotiating team for the US, and he attended all the CCAMLR negotiations, and he, in several of his recent papers, have stated quite clearly that the intent of the objective was to ensure that any harvesting, if it occurred, would not adversely affect the ecological relationships among all biological components, and that there would be some uncertainties in terms of management, and that therefore there could also be special area management. So you could set areas aside for biodiversity or for purposes or for science purposes where fishing didn't occur. So in fact, when they negotiated the convention, while they agreed that fishing could occur, it was quite clear that there were areas where fishing would not be allowed, and that was when the principles of Article 2.3 were not met, when an area was set aside for ecosystem conservation or for scientific study. So let's look at a current interpretation. So move from the 1980s through to 2019-20. So the current interpretations again raised, this is also from my interviews as well as a review of the the convention meeting reports, range from conservation is the primary intent. Yes, we can have harvesting if it proceeds according to the conditions established in Article 2.3. Other members say rational use is not subordinate to conservation, but it's crucial to the meaning of conservation. In other words, they need to be considered together. The third is that conservation needs should not outweigh or be prioritised over fishing needs. And the fourth is the conservation objective can best be met through delivery of precautionary ecosystem-based fisheries. So it's a little bit like the second one, rational use, although that rational use is not subordinate, is really about the balance, the so-called need to have a balance between the two. So if you look at those current interpretations and look at what is happening now in CCAMLR, you can see that there is no agreement on proposals that would pause or exclude fishing activities into the future for a long period of time. And for non-MPAs, it's very difficult to get any proposal up that would exclude fisheries. There's a very strongly different view on the value of MPAs. Why do we need them? What's the threat? Ignoring precaution, etc. There's different levels of understanding of the level of justification and information required to accept marine protected areas. Again, going against precaution, the level of justification and information required to accept a proposal to fishing is considerably lower than that required for a marine protected area proposal. And there's also different views on the value and necessity for consideration of climate impacts in fisheries considerations. which I have to admit surprises me, because I would have thought that climate change is going to impact fisheries. And I have some thoughts on that, which we'll come back to later on. I'd be interested in other people's views. Okay, so the recent very slow progress on the network of MPAs has been argued as evidence for this increasing lack of agreement around what the convention, the objective means. But really, the question needs to be asked, is this actually true? Because it's taken a very long time for CCAMLR to accept a full raft of krill fishery management measures. In fact, they still haven't finished. They've been working on it for 30 years. So it could be argued that for some areas, CCAMLR takes quite a long time. I'm not going to say that I agree with that. I'm just saying that you could argue that. You look at what's going on. So let's then look at what we might expect to see in CCAMLR if it was a conservation regime as distinct from a fisheries regime. So I think there's a range of things that we might expect to have seen them acting on over 38 years. So protection of unique, vulnerable and rare ecosystems, designation of areas for maintenance of biodiversity, protection of vulnerable species, independent science programs that are independent of fisheries needs, meeting Antarctic treaty obligations of peace, science, collaboration and conservation, promotion of the global values of Southern Ocean. I mean, Southern Ocean is pivotal in the stability of global climate processes. It's also really important in terms of looking at the impact of global human activity in terms of pollutants, not just climate change, but persistent organic pollutants, ozone depletion, etc. In other words, it acts as a really good global scientific laboratory, and that has a global value that is way beyond the fishing needs of one or two nations. And then the biodiversity and science values. Are they considering biodiversity and science values or other values before they approve fishing? In other words, in a conservation regime, you might expect some sort of strategic approach that says, here are areas that we're going to set aside for fishing or for conservation or for science, etc. And here is a process where whenever we consider any proposal for an activity, we will assess it against other values. So those are the sorts of things that you might expect. So let's have a look at what they have done. What I did was look at the implementation of its objective in practical terms. In other words, what management measures has it adopted over its 38 years. Now, management measures in CCAMLR are called conservation measures, which is somewhat confusing, but so I'll now call them conservation measures. So what have they accepted, or what have they adopted? Now, obviously, we would expect that there would be a large number of fisheries-related management measures, but we would also expect that there would be some measures related to those things that I noted earlier, or processes related to that. Okay, so if we look at conservation measures by using CCAMLR categories by year, this shows that after the first few years, generally speaking, they have adopted around 60 to 70 conservation measures each year. It's a little bit complicated because all the specific fisheries management measures are adopted every year or every second year. This is a good thing because it means that they're acting on the latest science, but it does confuse the number of conservation measures that they've adopted. In this graph, you can see the blue is compliance, and they have a comprehensive set of compliance measures. The orange is general fisheries management matters, and this is setting all the frameworks, etc., for looking at specific fisheries. The grey ones are the specific fisheries regulations. You can see there's a large number of those. And then in CCAMLR categories, the fourth one is protected areas, and you can see it's quite small overall. But the categories themselves, I think, tell us something about the way the Commission thinks, because they've skewed them towards fisheries. So we have compliance fine, then we have general fisheries, specific fisheries, and protected areas. But there's no science or research category. There's no protected species category, for instance. And in addition, the categories actually obscure a lot of the conservation that elements that have been taken up by CCAMLR, such as the prohibition of destructive bottom trawling gear, which actually protects a large amount of benthos, the ban on gill nets, efforts to reduce incidental mortality of seabirds during fishing operations. All of these are buried in the general fisheries matter category. And then the categories are really not consistently applied either. For example, registration of vulnerable marine ecosystems for protection is seen as a general fisheries matter rather than a protected area matter. So I, in all fairness, decided that I should look at this in a bit more detail, and I did a second categorization or a recategorization based on these following points. Sorry, I'm just going to check the timing. So I looked for which measures applied conservation that was independent of fisheries management, which extended conservation beyond the fishery but through fisheries, which reduced impact or minimized impact through fishing, which ones related to depleted species, which ones related to target fishing, science, and treaty obligations. And so when I did that, this is what I got. I don't have in here the general fisheries line. It's the line between grey and blue. The protected areas is this really pale blue one down here. This is basically it's not protected area, sorry, it's basically conservation that could stand beyond fisheries. This grey one here is depleted species protection, and the orange one is science, and the yellow-orange one is science, and this orange one here is conservation that extends beyond or is delivered through fisheries management, which I think you have to say is quite a small number. If you look at this at 2019, there's a very small number of conservation-oriented measures or measures that are delivering conservation over fisheries. This very big decline in the depleted species is not because they stopped looking at depleted species, by the way, it's just because they combined their management measures on depleted species into one. So if you look at overall the conservation measures that facilitate conservation or science beyond fisheries operations, over the entire period of 38 years, there were 13. There are 13 that are still in force, and of those, only 8 could stand independent of the existence of fisheries operation, although most of those don't, but they could in theory. So for instance, vulnerable marine ecosystems could stand if you didn't have fisheries operations, although most of those are identified through fishing. And Dale, please don't tell me that not all of them are, because Australia has identified some through independent research. Yes, I know that, but most of them come from fishing operations. There is an area set aside for scientific study following retreat of the glacier. That's Conservation Measure 2406. It's been limited to 10 years and it allows research fishing. Even though there is no fishing allowed for 10 years, it allows research fishing so that knowledge can be built up and they can zip in there straight away after 10 years. And the boundaries of both the marine protected areas, 9103, which is South Orkneys, and 9105, which is Ross Sea, are determined around fishing interests and were only accepted when the fishing interests were incorporated into the discussion. And now at least one country is requesting that there is provision for research fishing inside the general protection zone of the Ross Sea Marine Protected Area. So I have some general thoughts on this, is that all the finfish fisheries include some level of ecosystem-based consideration, but there's no systematic review of the effectiveness of these actions in achieving Article 2.3. There's no prior systematic consideration of values and uses built into the approval process of fishing. Basically, if you tick the fishing requirements, then fishing goes ahead, so therefore fishing has priority. There's no current management consideration of the uncertainties of climate. There's no systematic study of the impact of fishing activity on ecosystems, either directly impacted or beyond. There's no systematic value of the vulnerable or threatened species. There's only 4 protected VME sites, although there are a large number of others that are in close sites, but they don't have permanent protection. There's a very slow, if probably stalled, process for designating MPAs. So on the basis of that, I don't think they're doing too well on the, we are a conservation regime rather than a fisheries regime. So let's have a very quick look at what sort of scientific information the Commission asks for and what do they act on. So the Commission asks for scientific advice from the committee on a wide range of fisheries management issues, but also on a wide range of other issues as well. And the scientific committee consistently provides advice on a very broad range of issues that are of interest to the Commission outside of fisheries itself. If you do I did a sort of year by year, 10-year by 10-year study of what advice was taken up by the Commission, and the first 10 years are a nightmare because it took them some time to work it out, so we'll exclude them. And then through the 1990 through to 2010, which is basically 20 years, they routinely accepted 90% of the scientific committee advice in the year that the advice was given, but this primarily related to fisheries advice other than krill fishery. And if you look at how they've taken up krill fisheries advice, they've really struggled. It's taken them 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, sometimes 20 years to get things through. And in fact, the feedback management process for krill fishery, once it goes beyond the trigger level of 620,000 tonnes, is still not resolved, and they started work on that in 1990. One would suggest that that might be because it's not seen as urgent, but it does raise the question about whether you can say that CCAMLR is not a conservation regime when they're struggling themselves with some of their own fisheries responsibilities. If you look in the last 10 years, these are the issues where CCAMLR, the Commission has struggled the most. marine protected areas. It took them 5 years to adopt the marine protected area for Ross Sea, but they are now struggling to adopt the research plan, research monitoring plan for that MPA, and it's a 30-year MPA. They still haven't accepted East Antarctic, they still haven't accepted Weddell Sea, they haven't accepted Domain 1. They have committed to a system of marine protected areas. The scientific advice has said, yep, here is the advice, and that's good. So it would appear that they are now, some members are now regretting that they have actually committed to that MPA system. So in this case, they're definitely not acting as a conservation regime. It took them several years to accept a measure on science around ice shelf collapse, and we got a time-limited, very specific measure, which is under constant attack. They've been discussing response action for climate change since 2010. They've been getting science on this since, I don't know, 2002 or so. They cannot get response action through. We're still, as I said, struggling. Oh, we've finally got krill observer coverage at 100%, the same as other fisheries, starting in 2021. It's taken quite some time. And we still don't have the feedback management. And in the last couple of years, we've had a couple of very peculiar oppositions to fisheries management, fisheries proposals by Russia, which I think are sort of consensus-oriented power plays. So, I mean, I guess that raises the issue about how you get broader measures through when you have a consensus approach. So generally speaking on that, I should move on, is that they do act on scientific committee advice, generally speaking, particularly when it relates to finfish. They're slow to progress krill fisheries, but they are progressing, and perhaps that's because of a lack of urgency in terms of the fishery. It's seen as relatively small. They're stalled on MPAs, and there's been no progress on climate, despite the fact that science supports a precautionary approach. So very quickly on non-harvested species, you would expect that in a conservation regime. There's a number of species as well as polar ecosystems that are considered vulnerable or more by IUCN. In 1987, the Scientific Committee committed to reviewing the status of marine mammals and birds every 3 to 5 years. They did it periodically, particularly for seabirds through to 2011. And as far as I can see, they haven't done any systematic assessments since then. There's no systematic approach by the Commission to assessment of non-harvested species, and they haven't taken up the Antarctic Treaty approach of a state of the Antarctic environment report, which might be an indicator that they were looking at a systematic approach of assessing the impact of fishing on non-harvested species. I haven't finished this work yet, so I may well change a little or become more specific as I do a little bit more. So some general thoughts to conclude. CCAMLR has a load of achievements, many around fisheries, and they certainly have done a lot to world-leading work on ecosystem-based and precautionary approaches to fisheries management, and they have led the world on seabird mitigation measures and also on illegal, unregulated and unreported fishing activity. They have done done some really good work and accepted bans on destructive fishing practices and gear types. They do have a very good system for scientific observers and for data management. They've committed to the MPAs. They get lots of science data on climate change, but they don't have that strategic approach to conservation. They do have different interpretations of conservation, and I think you'd have to say an increasing value is being placed on fisheries over conservation. Could question whether or not the precautionary approach is being regularly assessed as a precautionary, particularly in a climate changing environment, because when did they last assess the precautionary approach in terms of how it applies to non-harvested species? When are they going to start looking at the risk of harvested species in a climate changing world, because that would imply that they needed a stronger or more conservative precautionary approach? There's no systematic consideration of other values. There's inadequate consideration of protected species. There's no MPA established that's consistent with or prioritises biodiversity. Fisheries are definitely prioritised over conservation values, and no action on climate. So I would leave with two questions. Can CCAMLR claim to be a conservation regime if it's only able to consistently deliver fisheries management? My view on that is that it's getting bloody close to not being able to do that. And we would need to see action, particularly on climate and resolution of the difficulty around MPAs, for them to be able to claim to be a conservation regime. And then the other question is, can it deliver broader conservation aspects of the objective, given the divergent views and an apparent inability to deal with the risks and uncertainties associated with a rapidly changing physical environment? And at that, I would thank you very much for listening to me, and apologise for speaking so long, and end.
Lovely. Thank you so much, Lyn, for such a super interesting and thought-provoking presentation. I don't know about anybody else, but I have got a whole bunch of questions for you.
Okay, I saw you scribbling there.
Yeah, absolutely. I would like to open it to the floor first of all, if anybody else has got any questions they'd like to throw at Lyn. Well, perhaps while everybody else is thinking what they're going to ask about, I'll take advantage and ask you some of mine.
Yeah.
One of the first questions I had, Lyn, actually went back right to the beginning of your talk when you sort of talked about the what was in the agreement, and you mentioned that in terms of resources,
yeah,
it wasn't just considered commercially exploitable resources. And I guess what I was wondering was, does that just refer to fish, or does it refer to everything? And in which case, what else would be harvested?
Oh no, it wasn't that. What I was referring to is a very peculiar and unfortunate word, resources. The definition of resources in the convention actually applies to, I was just trying to find the wording, a wide range of species. Let me just see if I can find the wording now. Oh yeah, here it is. So I can read it to you. Marine living resources means the populations of finfish, mollusks, crustaceans, and all other species of living organisms, including birds, found south of the Antarctic convergence. And so that's what resources means. And it wasn't that all of those would be harvestable. It's just that the convention is responsible for the conservation of all of those, whether they're harvested or not. Yeah.
Got you. Thank you for that clarification. That's my misunderstanding. Any questions from the floor, or shall I keep on asking questions?
Dale asked a question about 32 too. Was that because I didn't put it in a list, Dale, or what were you asking?
Yeah, I thought it might have made it into the list, but having gone back and read it again, it probably shouldn't be in that list.
No.
I did wonder about your point in, I think it was your discussion slide, where it said that CCAMLR hasn't looked at whales. When
No,
mainly
I
because
didn't.
CCAMLR's
Yeah.
own website say that they specifically exclude whales from their work.
Yeah. So I would argue that they are responsible for the conservation of whales in the convention, but they're not responsible for the management of whales, which are covered by the IWC. And in fact, they have had a couple of conversations with IWC about the current status of whales in the Southern Ocean, and they need to consider, or at least get the views of the IWC on the impact of fishing on whales in the Antarctic. So they may not necessarily do the work, but they're responsible for ensuring the conservation of whales in the region according to the objective. That's what I was trying to get at. Does it make sense?
Yeah, that makes sense, and it
Yeah.
feeds into the work that EMM are doing with their risk assessment on krill and stuff like that, and
Yeah.
how you put whales into that.
Yeah. Yeah, and so just to tell others, 3202 that Dale was referring to is the prohibition of directed fishing, and it's the list of all the species and areas where directed fishing, meaning targeting a specific species, is restricted or prohibited. And I didn't put it in my conservation list because it's about fishing. So,
That makes sense. Lynn, one of the other questions I had was around the measures themselves. So you talked a little bit about the ecosystem-based approach and kind of the fact that CCAMLR is attempting to take that sort of approach. But I was wondering if there was any consideration of the effectiveness of the measures. So you talked about data collection and monitoring and stuff like that. But is there any consideration of whether the measures are putting in place are even useful?
It's really, this is a really interesting question, and it's clearly a piece of work that needs to follow that initial work that I did. Whether I do it is another question altogether. The argument that CCAMLR would make is that they set precautionary limits, for instance, for catches, okay? And so both for targeted species and for bycatch. And that in their regular assessments that are happening every second year now, they would be able to pick up whether or not there had been any significant decline and therefore respond. They would certainly be able to do that for targeted species. And so on the basis of that, you would have to assume that they're, even though they haven't done any systematic analysis of the precaution, the precautionary approach for total allowable catches, the system that they have appears to be working. The bycatch limits controls, though, aren't actually set on a scientific basis. They essentially came out of, like, pretty much plucked out of the air by the now executive secretary of CCAMLR when he was a scientific rep. And they sort of vaguely looked reasonable at the time, but that was nearly 30 years ago, and there has been no systematic check of that. Again, we have research, fishing, we have tagging, we have some assessment of bycatch, but it's not as systematic as that for targeted fishing. So I would think that they're probably doing okay for those that are directly dependent or related, because they're considered on a regular basis, but they should be checking. As to species that are outside of harvested species or those dependent or related, the work is just not being done, so we don't know. And I mean, a case in point, see, albatross, so still albatross were declining significantly. So CCAMLR responded and implemented some very good seabird incidental mortality mitigation measures and reduced the number of birds caught right down to less than 100 a year. And in fact, we tend to panic if it's more than 3 or 4 in one fishery. So they did very well, you know, introduced mitigation measures to stop the direct mortality from fishing. However, albatross are still declining in the region. So, I think they need to be looking at assessment of these species and going, what should we be doing about this? Yeah. Absolutely. And it probably means that they need to be doing more work outside with other organisations outside of the convention. Yeah.
Absolutely. And my question as well would be around the MPA aspect and whether there's much monitoring of that, but it sounds like there's not. I think there's a really interesting question in the chat, which is, yes. What do you think is the driver for prioritising fisheries over conservation value, which I think is a great question.
Yeah, yeah. I mean, this is a really interesting question. How do you say your name, or tell me how you say your name? Take yourself off mute. Yeah.
Thanks. This is Olalekan.
Olalekan. Okay. Thank you.
Yes. Thank you.
Thank you very much. So, I think it's a complex question to answer. I think the first thing is that because CCAMLR is different to other bodies that have fisheries management responsibilities, and because it has largely insulated itself from other fora, it's not part of it's sort of connected to, but it's not part of the United Nations, for instance. New members and even new commissioners come into CCAMLR having no understanding of what it's about. So that's the first thing. And their only experience is from a fisheries perspective. Yeah, so that's the first thing. The second is that certainly for finfish, this is a high-end, high-technology fishery. And so most of the countries that are fishing finfish also accept conservation approach. So I mean, I think you could have a moot point about if push comes to shove, which one would they put above the other? And I suspect they would probably put fisheries above conservation. But generally speaking, countries like Australia, UK, New Zealand sort of, do actually promote conservation-oriented initiatives as well. The big question is around krill, and I think that China certainly has aspirations for a large-scale expansion of krill fishing, and that is not economically important, but food security, because krill at the moment is not a particularly high-end fishery. Yeah, so that's my answer. That's my complex answer to a complex question.
Thanks, Lyn. Do we have any other questions?
Yes, I have one.
Linda.
I'll put my hand down if I can. So, Lyn, the repeated failure of, if you want to count it that way, I am a journo, so I like to use words like that. The repeated failure of CCAMLR to successfully bring in those MPAs, particularly the East Australian one, the Eastern Antarctic one, has meant that they've copped a bit of flack in the media. After the most recent meeting, their credibility was called into question. So I suppose there are two things. One, is that justified? Is that response justified from the media and that public perception that they aren't doing what they should be? And if it isn't justified, do they therefore have a strategic communication problem?
Okay, great question. I would say that it is justified. And the reason why I would say it's justified is that the Commission is, by consensus, committed to the designation of a system of marine protected areas. They went through a very comprehensive scientific discussion to set the basis for the MPAs. That advice from the scientific committee was accepted. They then started to get proposals for MPAs fitting within that scientific framework, and then the problem started. The scientific committee provided advice on both, the scientific committee's provided advice now on the Ross Sea, East Antarctic and Weddell Sea, and Domain 1, so all of them. The South Orkneys is a bit different because it came up during the negotiations of the scientific basis. It came up before they'd actually committed to the system. So the scientific committee has provided advice which says that the objectives outlined in the proposals is reasonable, acceptable, based on scientific science, etc., etc. And because the Commission has committed to the system, then they should therefore accept the advice of the scientific committee. So, I mean, if it was a situation where they hadn't actually committed, then, and it was a proposal that was coming up, then you could say, okay, fine, this is a little bit more complicated. But they committed to it, and they reaffirmed that commitment, not once, but twice. So, you know, they really stuffed this up, if you like. And which is why I suggested that I think that what we are now seeing is that some countries are trying to pull back from that commitment. They're trying to say, oh, we didn't really understand, or we regret we did it, etc. And, you know, my answer to that is too bad, so sad. Like, you know, it's a consensus process. Everything else has to go through consensus. Oh, sorry, we gave you krill fishery. No, we don't want you to. That's not acceptable. So I think that on that argument, you know, it is reasonable to say that they accept that the FLAC is acceptable. Yeah.
Thanks, Lyn. I'm afraid that at this point I'm going to have to draw a close to the discussions, largely because it's just coming up to 2 o'clock. But I just
have to go on another group.
Exactly, yeah, I have to go join another meeting. So yeah, I just wanted to say thank you so much, Lyn, for taking the time to chat with us today. It's such an interesting topic. And also thank you to all the participants for your fabulous questions as well. Some really interesting discussions there. And if anybody has more questions for Lyn, I urge you to get in contact with her and have a chat further. And with that, I will draw this to a close. Thank you very much.